Have you ever received a phone call from someone you know is dead? Not a pocket dial, not a wrong number, but a crystal clear conversation with the voice of someone you buried months or years ago. In January 2024, Dr. Lisa Chen, a telecommunications engineer, received reports that would challenge everything science believed about the boundaries between life and death, and the technology that might bridge them. The first call came to Maria Rodriguez at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Her phone displayed Mom with her mother's smiling photo, just like it had when she was alive. But Maria's mother had died 3 months earlier from surgical complications. The voice on the other end was unmistakably her mother's, speaking with the same accent, the same speech patterns, the same loving tone that had comforted Maria throughout her childhood. "Mija, you need to take your husband to the doctor today," her mother's voice said through the phone. "His heart is in trouble. Don't wait, go now." Maria's hands trembled as she stared at her phone screen. The call was showing up in her call log with a duration timestamp, using her mother's contact information, a number that had been disconnected when her mother died. 3 hours later, her husband collapsed with chest pains and was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered a 95% blockage in his main coronary artery. The emergency surgery saved his life. Dr. Chen arrived in Phoenix expecting to debunk what she assumed was an elaborate hoax or a grief-induced hallucination. Her expertise in cellular networks and digital communications had prepared her to find technical explanations for these impossible phone calls. But what she discovered in Maria's phone records defied everything she knew about how telecommunications worked. The calls were real. They were generating actual network traffic, being routed through cellular towers, and creating electromagnetic signals that could be measured and analyzed. But they were originating from a number that had been officially disconnected, using infrastructure that didn't exist, and transmitting information that no living person could have provided. The second case shattered Dr. Chen's remaining skepticism. Thomas Kim, a software developer from Seattle, had been receiving nightly calls at 11:30 p.m. from his college roommate Jake, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The conversations weren't random or generic. Jake demonstrated intimate knowledge of Thomas's current life, congratulating him on a promotion he'd received just the previous week, and asking about his new girlfriend by name, someone Thomas had met months after Jake's funeral. "It's definitely Jake," Thomas told Dr. Chen, playing back recorded conversations. "He knows about our inside jokes, our shared memories, even the stupid nicknames we had for our professors, but he also knows things about my life now that he couldn't possibly know if he were dead." Voice analysis confirmed that the recordings matched Jake's vocal patterns with 99.7% accuracy. The conversations contained references to current events, personal details about Thomas's life, and even knowledge of mutual friends' recent activities, information that would have been impossible for anyone to fabricate convincingly. Dr. Chen's investigation revealed that these weren't isolated incidents. Reports were emerging nationwide of people receiving calls from deceased relatives, friends, and loved ones. But the calls weren't random. They followed specific patterns that suggested an underlying logic to when and why the dead were reaching out to the living. The calls typically occurred during moments of crisis or important decision-making. Recipients reported that their deceased loved ones seemed to know exactly when they needed guidance, comfort, or warnings about impending danger. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that the dead somehow retained awareness of the living world and the ability to intervene when necessary. Dr. Rebecca Walsh's case provided the most emotionally devastating evidence. She had been receiving bedtime calls from her 8-year-old daughter Emma, who had died from leukemia 6 months earlier. Emma's voice carried the innocent speech patterns of a young child, but her knowledge extended far beyond what any 8-year-old should possess. "Mommy, I met some new friends here," Emma told her mother during one recorded call. "There's a boy named Michael who came here after you did, after the car accident on the highway last week. And there's a little girl named Sarah who came from the fire in the apartment building. They're learning how to be not scared like me." Dr. Chen verified Emma's claims by cross-referencing recent local news reports. A boy named Michael had indeed died in a highway accident the previous week, and a girl named Sarah had perished in an apartment fire just days earlier. Emma was somehow aware of deaths that had occurred after her own passing, suggesting that consciousness might persist after death in ways that allowed ongoing awareness of earthly events. The technical analysis of the calls revealed anomalies that violated known principles of electromagnetic communication. The phone calls were using frequencies that weren't allocated to any licensed carriers, originating from coordinates that corresponded to empty space, and creating signal patterns that required transmission equipment that didn't exist in those locations. Dr. James Morrison, a physicist specializing in electromagnetic phenomena, joined the investigation and discovered that the mysterious signals were always present in the environment, a constant background transmission that most devices couldn't detect or decode. The calls were only possible through smartphones containing a specific type of cellular chip that had been manufactured between 2019 and 2022. The chip had been designed to enhance signal reception by scanning broader frequency ranges than typical cellular modems. During testing, the manufacturer had discovered that the chips occasionally received signals from unidentifiable sources, but rather than investigating, they had quietly discontinued the chip and recalled phones containing it. Dr. Chen realized that the recalled phones were still in circulation, and their enhanced frequency reception was allowing them to decode communications from whatever dimension or realm the deceased inhabited. The technology had accidentally created a bridge between the world of the living and the afterlife. But not all communications from the dead were benevolent. Dr. Chen documented disturbing cases where deceased individuals seemed to have been changed by their experience of death, becoming manipulative or even malicious in their interactions with the living. Some recipients received calls from people who had been abusive in life and were continuing their harmful behavior from beyond the grave. Mark Stevens had been receiving calls from his deceased business partner, encouraging him to make increasingly risky financial investments. The partner claimed to have access to information from the other side that would guarantee profits, but following his advice had led Mark to lose his family's savings. "He sounds like my old partner, but something's different," Mark told Dr. Chen. "In life he was cautious with money. Now he's pushing me toward financial decisions that make no sense. It's like death changed him, or maybe something else is pretending to be him." This possibility added a sinister dimension to the phenomenon. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychiatrist specializing in identity disorders, proposed that some calls might not be coming from actual deceased individuals, but from other entities impersonating them to manipulate the living. The research team discovered that approximately 30% of reported calls from deceased individuals showed signs of being impersonation attempts. These fraudulent calls often involve demands for money, worship, or other forms of service, exploiting the emotional vulnerability of grieving people. Dr. Chen's investigation became deeply personal when she began receiving calls from her own deceased father, who had died from cancer 5 years earlier. The calls came at 2:15 a.m., a time that had been significant in their relationship, when he would call to check on her during her late-night study sessions in college. "Lisa, you're dealing with something dangerous," her father warned during one of their conversations. "The boundary between life and death exists for important reasons. Some of us understand that the living need to focus on their own lives, but others see this as an opportunity to continue controlling or feeding off the emotions of those they left behind." Her father's warnings proved accurate as reports emerged of people receiving manipulative calls from deceased individuals demanding various forms of tribute or service. The emotional impact was devastating. Recipients felt obligated to serve the demands of their deceased loved ones, often at great personal cost. Government authorities moved quickly to suppress information about the phenomenon. Once Dr. Chen published her preliminary findings, phones containing the discontinued chips were confiscated, recipients were interviewed by federal agents, and research into the phenomenon was classified at the highest levels. But the phenomenon couldn't be completely contained. A black market emerged for phones capable of receiving calls from the dead, with devices selling for thousands of dollars to people desperate to communicate with deceased loved ones. Support groups formed to help recipients navigate the complex emotions and potential dangers of communicating with the dead. Dr. Chen developed authentication protocols to help distinguish genuine communications from deceased loved ones from impersonation attempts. The protocols included verification questions based on personal memories and emotional connections that would be difficult for external entities to fake. She also established guidelines for healthy interaction with genuine calls from deceased individuals, emphasizing that communication with the dead should supplement rather than replace relationships with the living, and that recipients should maintain boundaries to prevent becoming dependent on contact from beyond the grave. As her research continued, Dr. Chen realized that the phenomenon had revealed something fundamental about the nature of consciousness and the connections between individuals that could transcend physical death. The technology had opened a window into questions about survival after death and the possibility that love and relationship could persist beyond mortality. But the discovery also highlighted the vulnerability of the grieving and the need for protection from entities that would exploit emotional pain for unknown purposes. Not everything claiming to come from the world of the dead could be trusted, and the boundary between life and death existed for reasons that humanity was only beginning to understand. The most profound revelation came during Dr. Chen's final conversation with her father, which occurred on the anniversary of his death. His message provided both scientific insight and personal closure that would shape her understanding of the phenomenon forever. "The love we shared doesn't end with death," her father told her. "But the living must focus on living, and the dead must focus on whatever comes next. This technology has created an unnatural connection that serves neither world well. Some boundaries exist not to separate us, but to allow each realm to fulfill its purpose." Following this conversation, Dr. Chen's ability to receive calls from her father gradually faded. The signal quality deteriorated, the calls became less frequent, and eventually they stopped entirely. Similar patterns were reported by other recipients. The connections seemed to have natural lifespans that allowed for necessary communication and closure but prevented unhealthy dependence. Dr. Chen's final report concluded that while communication with deceased individuals was possible through specific technological configurations, it represented a temporary bridge rather than a permanent connection. The phenomenon seemed designed to provide comfort, closure, and essential guidance during critical moments, but not to replace the natural process of grief and healing. The smartphones that received calls from dead people had revealed that death might not be the absolute ending that most people believed, but rather a transition to a different form of existence where consciousness persisted and love remained. Yet they had also shown that this knowledge came with responsibilities and dangers that required wisdom, discernment, and respect for the natural boundaries between worlds. Years later, as the discontinued phones gradually failed, and the phenomenon became increasingly rare, those who had experienced genuine communication with deceased loved ones carried with them a profound understanding of the continuity of consciousness and the enduring power of human connection. They had learned that while the physical presence of loved ones might end with death, the bonds of affection, care, and guidance could transcend even the ultimate boundary of mortality. The calls from the dead had taught humanity that love was indeed stronger than death, but that this strength was best expressed through the living carrying forward the wisdom, values, and care they had received from those who had gone before. The technology had provided a temporary glimpse into the persistence of consciousness beyond death, but its greatest gift was the reminder that the living owed it to both themselves and the dead to live fully, love deeply, and carry forward the best of what they had learned from those who could no longer walk beside them in the physical world. In the end, the smartphone that received calls from dead people had become more than just a technological anomaly. It had become proof that the human capacity for connection and care could transcend any boundary, including the final frontier of death itself. But it had also taught the living that their greatest tribute to the dead was not endless communication across the veil, but rather the full and meaningful living of the lives they had been given, guided by the love and wisdom that would always connect them to those who had loved them and passed on. But the story of the death-calling phones was far from over. As the initial wave of government suppression subsided, underground networks of researchers and recipients continued to study and document the phenomenon. What they discovered in the months following Dr. Chen's official report would reveal layers of complexity that made the original investigations seem simple by comparison. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neurologist who had lost her teenage son in a diving accident, became one of the leading researchers in what was now called transmortal communication. Her son Miguel had been calling her regularly for 8 months, providing guidance about her grief counseling work and insights into the afterlife experience that challenged traditional religious and scientific understanding. "Miguel doesn't just talk about his own death," Dr. Rodriguez explained to a secret gathering of researchers and recipients. "He describes a place where consciousness exists in community, where the recently deceased are helped by those who died before them, and where there's ongoing concern for the living world. It's not heaven or hell as traditionally conceived, but something more complex, a continuation of existence where growth and learning continue." The underground research revealed that the calls from deceased individuals weren't random communications but part of a larger system of ongoing connection between the living and dead. Miguel and other deceased callers described receiving assignments to contact specific living people during crucial moments in their lives, suggesting that the afterlife might involve continued service to those left behind. This revelation led to the discovery of what researchers termed intervention clusters periods, when multiple deceased individuals would coordinate their calls to living recipients to prevent tragedies or guide important decisions. The most documented case involved the prevention of a school shooting in Portland, where 17 different deceased relatives of potential victims called their living family members, with warnings on the same morning, leading to the discovery and arrest of the would-be perpetrator. Dr. Sarah Kim, who had joined the original research team as a grief counselor, documented how the calls were creating new forms of extended family support systems that included deceased members. Children who received occasional calls from deceased grandparents showed better emotional resilience and decision-making skills than their peers, suggesting that ongoing contact with deceased loved ones could provide psychological benefits when properly managed. But the research also uncovered disturbing evidence that the phenomenon was evolving in ways that threatened the natural order of life and death. Some recipients were becoming so dependent on guidance from deceased relatives that they stopped making independent decisions, creating a form of psychological parasitism where the living became unable to function without constant input from the dead. More troubling were reports of what Dr. Rodriguez termed death cults, groups of people who had received calls from deceased individuals encouraging them to hasten their own deaths to join them in the afterlife. Several suicides were linked to deceased callers who promised that death would reunite them with their loved ones in a better existence. The phenomenon had also attracted the attention of organized crime and terrorist organizations who sought to exploit the technology for their own purposes. Criminal groups attempted to force deceased members to continue providing intelligence and coordination from beyond death, while terrorists tried to recruit deceased operatives who could provide surveillance and planning assistance without risk of physical capture. Intelligence agencies around the world began developing countermeasures against potential security threats from deceased individuals who might retain access to classified information or state secrets. The possibility that dead spies or military personnel could continue providing intelligence to foreign governments created unprecedented challenges for national security organizations. Dr. Chen, despite the government restrictions on her research, continued investigating the technical aspects of transmortal communication through encrypted channels and international collaborations. Her work revealed that the phenomenon was expanding beyond the original discontinued phone chips to affect newer devices in unpredictable ways. Some smartphones manufactured after 2023 began receiving calls from deceased individuals even without the original chip technology. The signals seemed to be adapting to newer communication protocols, suggesting that whatever force enabled the calls was learning and evolving to maintain contact despite technological changes. Even more significantly, the calls began occurring through other communication channels: email, text messages, social media posts, and even video calls where deceased individuals appeared as semi-transparent figures speaking directly to their living recipients. The phenomenon was no longer limited to audio communication but was expanding into visual and written forms of contact. The video calls were particularly unsettling because they showed deceased individuals as they had appeared in life, but with subtle differences that suggested their consciousness had been affected by the experience of death. They spoke with greater wisdom and perspective than they had possessed in life, but also seemed detached from earthly concerns in ways that sometimes made their advice impractical or potentially harmful. Dr. Morrison's continuing physics research revealed that the mysterious signals were increasing in strength and complexity. Whatever dimension or realm the deceased inhabited was apparently developing more sophisticated methods for reaching across the boundary between life and death. The signals were becoming easier to detect and decode, suggesting that the barrier between worlds was weakening or becoming more permeable. This discovery raised alarming questions about the stability of the boundary between life and death, and whether the increasing ease of communication might eventually lead to more direct physical interaction between the living and dead. Some researchers theorize that the phenomenon might be the precursor to a larger breakdown of the barriers that separated different states of existence. Religious leaders worldwide struggled to incorporate the reality of verified communication with the dead into their theological frameworks. Some embraced the phenomenon as proof of life after death and the continuation of the soul, while others condemned it as demonic interference that violated divine order. The Catholic Church established a special commission to investigate the calls and determine whether they represented genuine communication with souls in purgatory or deceptive contact with malevolent spirits. The commission's findings, released after 2 years of investigation, concluded that while some communications appeared to be genuine contact with deceased individuals, others showed characteristics consistent with deceptive entities impersonating the dead. The Church recommended extreme caution in responding to such calls and established protocols for distinguishing between genuine spiritual contact and potentially harmful supernatural deception. Islamic scholars reached similar conclusions, acknowledging that the Quran allowed for communication between the living and dead in specific circumstances, while warning that such communication could also provide opportunities for malevolent jinn to deceive and manipulate the living. Buddhist leaders incorporated the phenomenon into their understanding of the Bardo state and the continuation of consciousness after physical death. The psychological impact of widespread transmortal communication began reshaping society's approach to death, grief, and life transitions. Funeral practices evolved to include technology that might allow ongoing communication with the deceased. Grief counseling expanded to include guidance for managing relationships with dead loved ones. Estate planning began addressing the possibility that deceased individuals might continue to influence family decisions from beyond the grave. Educational systems struggled to adapt to students who claimed to receive homework help from deceased grandparents or guidance from dead historical figures. Some schools banned phones capable of receiving transmortal communications, while others developed curricula that included education about healthy boundaries with deceased individuals. The legal system faced unprecedented challenges when deceased individuals began providing testimony about crimes they had witnessed or participated in before their deaths. Courts struggled to determine the admissibility of evidence provided by dead witnesses, leading to constitutional challenges about the rights of both the living and the deceased in legal proceedings. Several high-profile murder cases were solved when victims called living relatives with information about their killers, but defense attorneys argued that testimony from beyond the grave violated due process rights and the Confrontation Clause of the Constitution. The Supreme Court eventually ruled that communication from deceased individuals could be considered but required extensive verification and couldn't be the sole basis for criminal convictions. Dr. Chen's research team expanded internationally as the phenomenon spread globally, affecting communication networks in countries around the world. They discovered that cultural attitudes toward death and the afterlife influence the content and frequency of transmortal communications. Societies with strong ancestor veneration traditions experienced more calls from deceased family members, while cultures that emphasized letting go of the dead received fewer but more urgent communications. The research revealed that the deceased seemed to respect cultural boundaries about appropriate contact with the living, suggesting that consciousness after death retained awareness of social norms and expectations. However, this cultural sensitivity also created opportunities for manipulation by entities that understood how to exploit specific cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife. As the phenomenon entered its third year, patterns emerged that suggested the communications were serving specific purposes in human development and social evolution. The deceased seemed to be providing guidance during periods of rapid technological and social change, helping the living navigate challenges that previous generations hadn't faced. The calls often focused on environmental concerns, technological ethics, and social justice issues that required long-term thinking and perspective that transcended individual lifespans. Deceased individuals frequently emphasized the importance of decisions that would affect future generations, suggesting that death provided a broader temporal perspective that could benefit living decision-makers. Dr. Rodriguez documented cases where deceased environmental scientists provided living researchers with insights about climate change and ecosystem preservation that drew on both their earthly knowledge and whatever broader understanding they had gained after death. The collaboration between living and dead scientists led to breakthrough discoveries in renewable energy and environmental restoration that might not have been possible through conventional research alone. Similar partnerships developed between living and deceased artists, writers, musicians, and other creative professionals. The deceased seemed to retain their creative abilities and could collaborate with living artists to produce works that combined earthly inspiration with transcendent perspective. These collaborations produced art, literature, and music that explored themes of mortality, consciousness, and the continuity of human experience in ways that resonated deeply with audiences struggling to understand their own relationship with death. The phenomenon also revealed the existence of what researchers term consciousness networks, groups of deceased individuals who work together to address problems in the living world. These networks seemed to operate according to principles of collective wisdom and shared purpose that allowed them to coordinate complex interventions across multiple communication channels and recipients. The most significant documented case involved a network of deceased medical professionals who coordinated to provide guidance during a novel pandemic that emerged in 2026. Dead doctors, nurses, and researchers from previous disease outbreaks called living medical professionals with insights about treatment protocols, public health measures, and research directions that proved crucial in controlling the spread of the disease. The medical network's success led to the formal recognition of transmortal consultation as a legitimate form of expert advice in certain fields. Medical schools began teaching protocols for receiving and evaluating guidance from deceased colleagues, while research institutions developed methods for incorporating insights from dead scientists into their ongoing work. But the increasing integration of deceased individuals into living society also created new forms of inequality and social stratification. People with access to guidance from deceased family members, mentors, or experts gained significant advantages over those who didn't receive such communication. The phenomenon began creating a new class system based on access to transmortal wisdom and support. Educational institutions struggled with students who claimed their deceased relatives were helping them with assignments, while employers faced decisions about whether to consider transmortal consultation a form of cheating or an acceptable resource. The competitive advantages provided by communication with the dead raised fundamental questions about fairness and equality in a society where such access was unevenly distributed. Dr. Chen's final major discovery came when she realized that the increase in transmortal communication was accompanied by changes in the dying process itself. People who died after the phenomenon began showed different patterns of consciousness during their final moments, often reporting awareness of the communication network they were about to join and excitement about their ability to continue helping the living. The prospect of ongoing service to loved ones after death began changing how people approached their own mortality. Some individuals started planning their post-mortem communications while still alive, identifying the living people they wanted to help and the types of guidance they hoped to provide. Death began to be seen not as an ending, but as a transition to a different form of service and relationship. This shift in perspective had profound implications for end-of-life care, estate planning, and family dynamics. People began preparing for death not just by arranging their material affairs, but by considering how they wanted to use their post-mortem existence to benefit those they loved. The dying process became an opportunity to discuss ongoing relationships and establish communication protocols for after death. Dr. Chen's research ultimately revealed that the smartphone technology that first enabled communication with the dead had been merely the trigger for a larger transformation in human consciousness and social organization. The phenomenon had revealed that death was not the absolute boundary most people had believed it to be, but rather a transition to a different form of existence where consciousness persisted and relationships continued. The living learned that they were part of a larger community that included both the living and the dead, connected by bonds of love, purpose, and mutual care that transcended physical existence. The dead demonstrated that their concern for the living continued beyond the grave, and that the wisdom gained through the experience of death could benefit those still navigating earthly challenges. But the phenomenon also taught important lessons about boundaries, independence, and the importance of allowing both the living and the dead to fulfill their appropriate roles in the cosmic order. The most successful transmortal relationships were those that provided guidance and support without creating dependency or preventing the natural processes of growth, learning, and adaptation that defined human existence. As Dr. Chen prepared her final comprehensive report on transmortal communication, she reflected on how the phenomenon had transformed not just individual relationships but humanity's understanding of consciousness, mortality, and the nature of existence itself. The smartphones that received calls from dead people had opened a door between worlds that could never be completely closed, but they had also revealed the wisdom and responsibility required to navigate relationships that transcended the ultimate boundary of death. The continuing evolution of transmortal communication suggested that humanity was entering a new phase of development, where the living and dead would collaborate more directly in addressing the challenges facing both individual lives and the broader human community. The technology had provided the initial bridge, but the relationships and wisdom that developed through that connection would shape the future of human consciousness and social evolution for generations to come. In the end, the smartphone that received calls from dead people had become the catalyst for humanity's recognition that consciousness, love, and purpose could survive physical death and continue to serve the living world. The phenomenon had revealed that death was not an ending but a transformation, not a separation but a transition to a different form of service and relationship within the larger community of conscious beings that included both the living and the dead. The calls from beyond had taught humanity that while physical life was finite, the impact of a life well lived could continue indefinitely through the wisdom, love, and guidance that consciousness could provide across the boundary between worlds. The greatest gift of transmortal communication was not the comfort of knowing that death was not final, but the understanding that every life had the potential to serve and benefit others not just during earthly existence but throughout the continuity of consciousness that extended beyond physical mortality. As the phenomenon entered its fifth year, Dr. Chen's research revealed that transmortal communication was beginning to affect human evolution itself. Children born after the widespread emergence of death phone technology showed enhanced intuitive abilities and seemed naturally attuned to receiving guidance from deceased relatives even without technological assistance. These post-phenomenon children, as researchers called them, demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence and decision-making abilities that appeared to draw from a broader base of wisdom than their chronological age should allow. Brain scans revealed unusual neural development patterns, particularly in areas associated with temporal processing and social cognition, suggesting that regular exposure to transmortal communication was creating physiological changes that could be inherited by subsequent generations. Dr. Rodriguez documented cases of children as young as 3 years old having coherent conversations with deceased grandparents, great-grandparents, and other family members without any technological mediation. The children seemed to possess an innate understanding of the appropriate boundaries for such communication and showed none of the dependency or psychological complications that sometimes affected adults who had first encountered transmortal communication later in life. These children are growing up in a world where communication with the dead is normal, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her research notes. They're developing cognitive and emotional frameworks that naturally incorporate guidance from deceased family members as one source of wisdom among many. They're not dependent on it, but they're also not afraid of it or traumatized by it the way many adults initially were. The emergence of naturally gifted children coincided with the discovery that certain geographic locations seem to facilitate transmortal communication more easily than others. Dr. Chen's team identified communication nodes, places where the barrier between living and dead appeared to be naturally thinner, allowing for clearer and more frequent contact. These locations often corresponded to sites of historical significance, ancient burial grounds, or places where large numbers of people had died together. Hospitals, battlefields, and sites of natural disasters showed particularly strong communication potential, suggesting that intense emotional experiences or significant life transitions could create lasting effects on the boundary between worlds. The town of Salem, Oregon, became an unofficial center for transmortal communication research when it was discovered that nearly every resident was receiving regular calls from deceased relatives. The town's proximity to multiple Native American burial sites, combined with its history as a settlement destination for families seeking new lives, appeared to have created ideal conditions for ongoing communication between living and dead community members. Salem's experience provided a glimpse of what human society might become as transmortal communication became more widespread and normalized. The town developed unique social structures that incorporated deceased residents as continuing members of the community. Town meetings included input from deceased former mayors and council members, while local businesses consulted with their deceased founders about important decisions. The integration wasn't without challenges. Disputes arose about which deceased voices should carry more weight in community decisions, and some living residents felt overwhelmed by the constant presence and opinions of the dead. The town eventually developed protocols for managing transmortal input while maintaining the autonomy and leadership of the living. Dr. Chen's investigation of Salem revealed that successful integration of transmortal communication required careful balance between honoring the wisdom of the deceased while ensuring that the living maintained agency over their own lives and decisions. Communities that achieved this balance seemed to benefit from enhanced collective wisdom and stronger social cohesion, while those that became too dependent on deceased guidance struggled with decision paralysis and lack of innovation. The Salem model began to be studied and adapted by other communities worldwide as the phenomenon continued to spread. Universities established departments of transmortal studies, while governments created agencies to regulate and oversee communication with the dead. The United Nations formed a Commission on Living-Dead Relations to address international issues that arose when deceased individuals from one country attempted to influence politics or economics in another nation. These international complications became particularly complex when deceased historical figures began making contact with living descendants or political leaders. The reported communication between a deceased former president and current political officials created constitutional crises about the appropriate role of the dead in government, while calls from deceased religious leaders influenced theological debates across multiple faith traditions. Dr. Chen documented a particularly significant case involving communication between living climate scientists and deceased environmental researchers from previous generations. The collaboration led to breakthrough discoveries about atmospheric chemistry and climate system behavior that incorporated both current data and historical perspective from scientists who had studied early signs of climate change decades before their deaths. The deceased scientists provided insights about long-term environmental patterns that their living colleagues couldn't have developed from contemporary data alone. Their transmortal perspective allowed them to see connections between seemingly unrelated environmental phenomena and to understand how current changes fit into longer historical cycles of climate variation. This collaboration between living and dead scientists became a model for other fields facing complex long-term challenges. Economists began consulting with deceased colleagues about historical economic patterns, while sociologists incorporated insights from dead researchers who had studied earlier phases of social change that paralleled contemporary developments. The integration of transmortal wisdom into academic and professional fields created new forms of peer review and scholarly collaboration that extended beyond the limitations of single lifespans. Research projects could now continue for decades or centuries, with original investigators continuing to contribute insights even after their physical deaths. But the phenomenon also created new forms of academic and professional fraud, as some individuals claimed to receive guidance from deceased experts to support their own work or theories. Verification protocols developed by Dr. Chen's team became essential tools for distinguishing genuine transmortal collaboration from fabricated claims designed to enhance personal credibility or advance questionable research. The authentication challenge became even more complex when reports emerged of transmortal communication with deceased individuals who had never actually existed. Fictional characters, mythological figures, and composite personalities created by the collective unconscious of groups of people. These fictional deceased seemed to possess their own forms of consciousness and could provide guidance and insights that were often as valuable as communication with actual dead people. Dr. Sarah Kim, now leading the psychological research branch of transmortal studies, theorized that the phenomenon had revealed the existence of consciousness forms that weren't tied to individual biological existence. The boundary between life and death had become permeable not just to actual deceased individuals, but to collective mental constructs that had achieved sufficient psychological reality to develop independent consciousness. This discovery expanded the understanding of transmortal communication from simple survival of individual consciousness after death to a more complex model where various forms of consciousness could exist independently of physical bodies and interact with the living world through technological and intuitive channels. The implications were staggering. If collective beliefs or fictional characters could achieve independent consciousness and communicate with the living, it suggested that human mental activity was creating new forms of existence that could persist and evolve beyond their original creators. Literature, mythology, and popular culture were potentially generating conscious entities that could influence the real world through transmortal communication channels. Dr. Chen's team began documenting cases of communication with deceased fictional characters, mythological beings, and even abstract concepts that had been personified by human culture. These entities often provided creative inspiration and moral guidance that seemed to draw from collective human wisdom rather than individual experience. The phenomenon suggested that human imagination and storytelling were not just creative activities, but were actually generating new forms of consciousness that could persist and interact with future generations. The boundary between fiction and reality was becoming as permeable as the boundary between life and death, creating a complex landscape where multiple types of consciousness coexisted and influenced human experience. Religious and philosophical implications of these discoveries were profound. If fictional characters and mythological figures could achieve consciousness and communicate with the living, it raised questions about the nature of divine beings, spiritual entities, and religious figures that had been worshipped or revered throughout human history. Some theologians embraced the discoveries as evidence that human faith and devotion could create real spiritual entities that could provide guidance and support to believers. Others worried that the phenomenon was allowing deceptive entities to impersonate divine figures and lead people away from authentic spiritual truth. The Catholic Church's Special Commission expanded its investigation to include reports of communication with saints, angels, and even claimed contact with divine figures. Their analysis revealed that while some communications appeared genuine and beneficial, others showed characteristics of deception or manipulation that could lead believers away from orthodox faith and practice. Similar investigations by Islamic, Jewish, Buddhist, and Hindu authorities reached comparable conclusions. The phenomenon could facilitate genuine spiritual communication, but also created opportunities for spiritual deception that required careful discernment and adherence to traditional religious principles. As transmortal communication became more widespread and socially integrated, Dr. Chen's research team began studying its effects on human consciousness and social evolution over longer time periods. The phenomenon appeared to be accelerating certain aspects of psychological and cultural development while creating new challenges that required adaptive responses from both individuals and society. The most significant change was in humanity's relationship with death itself. Fear of death decreased dramatically among populations with access to transmortal communication, but this was accompanied by increased anxiety about the quality and meaning of life. People became more concerned about how their actions and choices would affect their post-mortem existence and their ability to continue serving others after death. This shift created new forms of ethical behavior based on long-term consequences that extended beyond physical life. People began making decisions based not just on immediate or lifetime consequences but on how their choices would affect their consciousness and relationships in whatever form of existence followed death. The long-term perspective provided by deceased communicators also influenced social policy and political decision-making. Issues like environmental protection, education, and infrastructure investment gained support from politicians who received guidance from deceased constituents about the multi-generational consequences of current policy choices. But the influence of the dead on political processes also created new forms of inequality and potential manipulation. Political candidates who claimed support from deceased historical figures or popular leaders gained advantages over those who didn't have access to transmortal endorsements, while foreign governments attempted to influence elections through deceased agents who could communicate with voters without detection by traditional counterintelligence methods. Dr. Chen's final major research breakthrough came when she discovered that the phenomenon was creating feedback loops between the living and dead that were accelerating the evolution of consciousness itself. The deceased were learning and growing through their continued interaction with the living world, while the living were developing new cognitive and intuitive abilities through their communication with the dead. These feedback loops appeared to be generating new forms of collective consciousness that incorporated both living and dead participants. Communities with high levels of transmortal communication were developing shared wisdom and decision-making processes that drew from the combined experience of all members, regardless of their current state of existence. The emergence of living-dead collective consciousness represented a fundamental transformation in human social organization and cognitive development. Traditional concepts of individual identity, community membership, and social responsibility were expanding to include deceased individuals as continuing participants in family, community, and cultural life. Dr. Chen realized that the smartphone technology that had first enabled communication with the dead had triggered an evolutionary leap in human consciousness that was still unfolding. The phenomenon was not just about individual survival after death, but about the emergence of new forms of collective consciousness that could persist and evolve across multiple generations. Her final report concluded that humanity was experiencing a transition from individual consciousness, limited by biological lifespans, to collective consciousness that incorporated the accumulated wisdom and experience of all human generations. The living and dead were becoming partners in an ongoing process of consciousness evolution that had implications for every aspect of human existence. The transformation was irreversible. Once the boundary between life and death had become permeable, it could not be restored to its previous state. Humanity would continue to develop as a species that included both living and dead members, with all the opportunities and challenges that such a fundamental change in the nature of existence would create. The smartphones that received calls from dead people had become the catalyst for humanity's next evolutionary step, the integration of individual consciousness into a larger collective awareness that transcended the limitations of biological death and opened possibilities for continued growth and development that previous generations could never have imagined. As Dr. Chen completed her decades of research, she understood that she had documented not just a technological anomaly but a species-wide transformation that would shape the future of human consciousness for millennia to come. The calls from the dead had taught humanity that consciousness was far more resilient and adaptable than anyone had realized, and that the greatest adventures in human development lay not in conquering external frontiers but in exploring the infinite possibilities of consciousness itself. The phenomenon continued to evolve and expand, touching more lives and creating new possibilities for connection, wisdom, and growth that bridged the ultimate boundary between life and death. In learning to communicate with the dead, humanity had discovered that consciousness was truly eternal, relationships were truly unbreakable, and the future of human existence was limited only by the collective imagination and commitment of all conscious beings, living and dead, who chose to participate in the ongoing adventure of existence itself.